I can't tell you how pleased and happy I am to be able to be here. It's a long way to come. I live in Italy, but it isn't that I only came here for this evening. In fact, it's today that I'm on my way back to Italy. This meeting is, however, important for several reasons. By the way, first of all, I'd like to, because I think it's my place to do so, thank the organization that made this hall available to us, the owners of this place. It's a wonderful and generous gesture on their part, and we're very grateful to them. The book itself, it's odd because really I'm only the ghostwriter, but I'm in flesh and blood, and the actual writer isn't in flesh and blood. What happened was that years ago, I discovered that this book was not actually written by Yogananda. It was ghostwritten for him on the basis of an outline that he had written for how he could bring his message out to the world. And it was all written, the outline was written in Bengali. This was back in 1920, and he hadn't learned English really yet. So he asked a friend of his who had an MA degree and was learned in English if he would not be so kind as to write the book out for him. It was, in fact, a disciple of his. But I always loved the book for its concepts, but I didn't love it for its style. Frankly, it was boring, it was pedantic, it was much too ponderous, and when I learned a year ago that we were thinking of putting it out again in a new edition, I thought, well, let me see if I can do a little work with it. Well, that little work meant redoing the whole book. It's the story of my life, I guess. The fact is that it was so central to everything that he brought. It was really his central teachings, and not to quibble, this is not 56, it's 55 years. Not much difference. But I have, for all these years, this has been my central focus. So I felt that I really have some right to express it, his teaching, but in words that I could make also my own. So I'm more than a ghostwriter, and yet it's all his teaching, and that's why he is listed as the author. I finished this book, literally, what is today? Thursday. I finished it Monday. This is the galley, but I've done quite a bit of work since the galley, and I think that authors in general tend to do this kind of thing. So don't trust this book. But wait till it comes out in September. This is available, and it's available free. It's not for sale. It says for galley only and not for resale. And it's not perfect, but it's not so bad, really. And what I loved about his teaching was that he didn't come. See, there are 2 points of view, 2 ways you can approach truth. One is to look at it as the abstraction, truth. The other is to look at it from the standpoint of the person who's got to receive this truth. Now, that was the weakness in that book. It was written from the standpoint of what I've got to say, but not from the standpoint of what they could understand. And the wonderful thing about his message, and the message central to this book, is that it's really people-oriented, reader-oriented, not God-oriented. It was a totally new approach. Not what does God demand of human beings, but what do people really want? Everybody in the world wants something. And that is far more important to us, if we can get that as a handle, than all the abstractions that God is omniscient, omnipotent, the cosmic ground of being, all these things that get you sort of nodding your head and say, yeah, that's pretty deep stuff. I don't know what it's about. This takes it right where you are, where your needs are. And in fact, And this was a defect in that book because it made it look as if people were particular in their in this particular approach and this attitude, whereas in fact it's all over the world. The universe, you could guess. There's something in all sentient creatures that makes them want happiness. Now, people don't think of happiness when they think of God, usually. They think of Him as there sort of making your life miserable in any way that you can think of. How can you please Him by somehow displeasing yourself? How can you do the right thing and not be too utterly miserable? This seems to be the approach of religion. I'm exaggerating it. And of course, if you want to, you can say, yeah, but. Nonetheless, you'll see that morality, ethical principles, spiritual principles are basically designed as they understood, not as they were originally designed, to be as inconvenient as possible. Now, the truth is, why shouldn't we have a good time? But the point is that we don't always know how to have a good time. And there's the rub that brings this book into focus and makes it so important. All life wants two things, basically, as Yogananda pointed out. People want to escape pain, suffering, sorrow, and people want to find happiness. They don't know happiness, but they know pleasure. And even worms have been found that they can train worms to give them shocks so they won't, because they don't like the shock, they won't, and after a while they can learn not to take a particular channel and squirm in the right direction to get some sort of a tidbit. Rats, of course. All animals are looking for the same thing. We're not different from them. All animals are looking for getting away from pain and finding some kind of pleasure. Now that's a key. God isn't offering us pleasure, for sure, but He's offering us something that pleasure leads toward. We are, all of us, wanting to get out of, what is pain? Well, pain is, basically it's when we offend against the law. Now those poor little worms, they've had the law created for them. It's an artificial law. Nonetheless, they learn that if they squirm in the wrong direction, they get a shock. And finally, even worms can learn. I just had the thought the other day. Here they're talking in science about how if we can just get computers to equal human intelligence, we can make them conscious like you and me. Well, what about worms? They're a fairly basic computer. You don't have to come up to the level of a human computer. I should think that science today can create little worm-like creatures that react mechanically. If you try to make that your proof that they're conscious, you'll find that it doesn't work. They will only go in the channels that the mechanisms that they're programmed to go in. But worms somehow, one worm will go this way, another worm will go that way, and then somehow you'll find that you can't be convinced that they aren't conscious. Whereas you take the most cleverly designed little mechanism, and boy, it seems awfully real. But in the end, you have to say, no, it's not. You can't create consciousness, because consciousness is the beginning, it's not the result. This whole universe was brought into existence out of consciousness. It's really quite that simple. Consciousness is the infinite that dreamed this universe into existence, dreamed you and me into existence, and all of a sudden we find that consciousness says, well, so what about the rocks? Yes, they're conscious. You know, this is one of the amazing discoveries in science in the 20th century. Started with Jagadish Chandra Bose in India, went on to, I forget who it was, in Germany, and some other scientist in, in America, who found that there is a response, even in rocks, that is not essentially any different from nerves. That everything in life is either, and this is the stumbling block that scientists will bring up. They'll say, okay, that means none of us is conscious. Pretty stupid. They have to be conscious to come up with that solution. Or everything is conscious. And that's where physicists, chemists, and people like that say, wait a minute, we can't accept this. It is the simple fact. The reason those rocks even have a response similar to nerves is because there is a degree of consciousness. In the Indian teachings, they say that God sleeps in the rocks. He dreamed the rocks into existence. It's not as if you could sit down and play a game of chess with a rock. I know that there were people who had pet rocks. They could, they could stroke them, but the rock couldn't. couldn't respond. But they've discovered in plants, for example, that and they say that God dreams in the plants. This is in the ancient scriptures. And in that dream, you see that there is a certain amount of consciousness in plants. They strain up to the sun. Well, that's a simple experiment. You can call it, well, it's just photoelectric or something or other. I don't know the terms. I'm not a scientist. But the point is that they found out that these plants really do have a certain consciousness. That if you love your plants, they'll flourish. If you hate them, they won't. There was an experiment done with two plants on each side of the front door. One was, they said, I hate you, I can't stand you, you're ugly. The other one said, oh, you're so beautiful, I love you, thank you for living, and so on. The one that they were thanking and loving flourished, and the other one drooped and died. Now, there have been a lot of experiments like that. They've been able to do, and I urge you, if you haven't read them, it's one of the most fascinating things that have come out in our age, that there really is a degree of conscious response in the plants. Not very. Again, I don't think you could sit down and play a game of bridge with a plant, but there is something there. And it's interesting that a lot of the plants today don't have the life in them that you get in societies that are more primitive and closer to nature and love what they're doing, instead of just scrolling through with a machine. And although you've got, I don't know all these things as facts, I can report them as having been given as facts, that 70, 80 years ago, there was a much higher percentage of actual vitality in vegetables like spinach, peas, etc., than there is today. Because we aren't thinking of them that way. They don't respond in that way. There is something in life, in nature, that's reciprocal. There is consciousness everywhere, and that's the point that I really want to make, that this consciousness is the bedrock, the foundation of everything. Now, the more you can think that way, the more you can begin to have a rapport with nature everywhere. You can love nature and it loves you back. I used to take a lot of photographs. I've got about 15,000 photographs. And I showed a slideshow of Hawaii. And somebody later said something to me that it looked as if the flowers you were taking were responding to your love. Now, was that only poetic? I'd like to think not. I'm perfectly willing to think it may have been. But there is something there. There is a certain reciprocal feeling. Some people have what they call a green thumb. There's a response in them. Now, I am too much of a writer, too much of a philosopher. I remember I lived in the monastery of New Kamaldoli in Big Sur, south of Big Sur, many years ago. And my little garden had no plants in it, so I just, with all sorts of enthusiasm, bought a plant of pansies and brought them out there to plant. Well, I looked out the window 2 months later and they were dead in their box. Well, I guess I'm not one of those people who can really claim anything in this direction. But nonetheless, I do see it. I see that there's some people who have that real sensitivity. I knew a woman who was a gardener, and she used to call the flowers her children. It was more than a sweet, poetic, sentimental fancy. They also flourished under hers. I'm not so sure they'd flourish under me, but I don't want to talk about that one. There is this thing at the heart of nature that is not that different from you. All life wants, yes, pleasure to begin with, but pleasure is counterfeit happiness. Pleasure it's always up and down. This world is just waves of pleasure and pain. Each succeeds the other. And you can never expect one not to result in the other. Years ago, I fulfilled a real desire that I'd always had to get a motorhome to travel the country to lecture. And we got this motorhome, and I remember I knew that I shouldn't. My whole philosophical training told me, don't go overboard in your enthusiasm. I said, it doesn't matter, I know it, but I just love this motorhome. And I sat back and just laughed my head off. I thought, well, I know I'll have to pay for it. Doesn't matter, let it be. That same evening, Vidura, we were parked in the parking lot of a Safeway supermarket, and Vidura was driving, and he forgot to put because it was new, and he forgot to put it in park, and we put the brake on, and he went back to the fridge to get something, and I was poised up there with on one knee getting something from the door up above, and the thing was slowly moving, and we didn't know it. It hit the Safeway. It obviously was not going very fast, and it didn't do any great damage, but it threw me onto the floor, broke a finger, and I just lay back and had just as big a laugh as I'd had the first time in getting it, because I knew that's the way the law works. Now, that was when you don't have much in the way of wanting this and wanting that. These things operate more quickly. But you do know, for example, that when somebody gets drunk, there is a morning after. When you have a high time, there's always something to sort of offset it, isn't there? You can't. You can never. In fact, that's one of the big delusions, that if I just do this and that and that and that, finally I'll have it made. You'll just never have it made. I tell you, your peak of success is going to be your valley of failure in a very little time. That's the law of life. You can't keep the waves on the ocean standing still. They always move. Life always moves. Life inevitably is going to give you pluses and minuses, and they always cancel each other out. Now, to get philosophical on you, it's like this, that God is infinite consciousness. Now, how is he going to bring this universe into existence? When you want to build a table, well, you go out and buy the wood. If you don't have the tools, you go out and buy the tools. You make the table. It's out here. God didn't have anything to make the universe out of. He had to bring it into existence out of his own consciousness. He dreamed it into existence. You and I are his dreams. And mind you, this is not a teaching that could have been taught that easily, say, a couple of hundred years ago. But now science has proved that the chair you're sitting on is not nearly so hard as it looks, because it's mostly space. And in fact, really speaking, the space in your body is comparable to the space out there. Quite comparable. Do you know the light from the nearest star takes 4 or is it 5 light years to reach our solar system, our Earth? Now that's a long time. 186 miles a second and 4 years to get here. And in between, space. That's how your body is. If you could remove the space in your body from your body, it's quite possible your body even would be invisible. It would be so small. Then science has discovered that that's not the whole story either. That in fact, you're really a manifestation of energy. All matter exists only as a manifestation of energy. Now the world is so different from anything that people could imagine a few centuries ago, but it's beginning to open up the possibility to a whole new way of looking at things. What we see with our eyes is a very limited part of the total spectrum of light. What we hear with our ears is a very small part. Dogs can hear better than us. You can hear better than me. It's all just, we're limited, but the totality is much greater. Everybody is looking for a success, but doesn't find it. Therefore, pleasure is really counterfeit happiness. Because what you get today, you're going to lose tomorrow. Pleasure and pain are opposites, and they're constantly succeeding one another. But man reaches the point of discovering that pleasure too, that happiness is more than pleasure, because happiness is something you can keep with you all the time. You can be very physically unwell. I know I had an operation on my heart a few years ago here in Sacramento. And the cardiologist said to me that, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Great." He said, "Come on, you've got to be in a lot of pain." I said, "Well, yeah, my body's in pain, but I feel so great because I feel more energy than I had before." You can be happy when your body is suffering. So pain and pleasure are opposites, but pain and happiness are not. Pleasure is counterfeit happiness. And when we understand that what we're really looking for is happiness, then we're beginning to understand what life is about. The trouble is that happiness too can become boring. Supposing you fulfill a desire that you've had all your life, perhaps for a cottage by the sea, rose-colored trellis, birds singing, beautiful garden, and you enjoy this. For how long, however? A year? Great. 10 years? I don't know. 50 years? Impossible. You'd get bored. You need a little something to sort of knock you on the head and convince you you're still alive. Happiness in the ordinary human sense is not what we're looking for. It's counterfeit what? Bliss. We have all come from bliss. We are manifestations of bliss. God, the best definition of God is bliss, because in fact that is what all creatures are looking for. Now it's not so obvious when you see a worm. He's trying to avoid getting stung with that electric shock. It's not particularly overjoyed when he gets to sort of gobble the earth. His ability to enjoy is somewhat, let's say, minimal. But you begin to see that there is something in animals that makes them say they want pleasure, active pleasure. And they want more and more as they reach the human level, and as evolution comes to the level of appreciation, of sensitivity. You see that what all people want basically is not just pleasure, it's happiness. Now there are certain laws of life that are very interesting to observe. That you'll notice this all over the world, that every culture speaks of heaven as up above and hell as being down below. And yet you know that it's not so. For one thing, what's up for us is down for people in Australia. Does that mean that they think that hell is what we would call up? No. Because it's really a matter of their own focus of consciousness. It's their own bodies. What is up for their own bodies, what makes them feel high. We all have those expressions. I don't speak very many languages out of the many that are available. I speak several. But in all the ones I know, and I can't imagine there being any that don't have it, When you feel good, you say, I feel high, I feel uplifted, I feel like soaring. When you feel low or unhappy, you feel downcast, depressed, heavy. Everything seems to take your consciousness down. There is something in us that makes us want to raise our consciousness. And the more, even your own self, and this is where you get into a science of religion, those attitudes, those actions, those principles that lift your consciousness are those that will bring you closer to what we think of as heaven. What are those? Because so many people, they don't know and they don't understand these principles. They misread the signs and they get all screwed up. Some people think, well, I'm happy when I drink. Are you happy after you drink? No, well, no. But I can just drink again. Glorious, one keg of beer for the four of us, and so on. But somehow, the people that I've met, and I suspect all the ones you've met, if they live that way, you just don't want to be like them. They're a bunch of slobs, let's face it. Because their energy is not up, it's always down. And you notice that very interesting thing, because the lower you are in your body, the more your energy is down in the lower part. Hell, you might say, quite really. And so animals who haven't yet had the opportunity to raise their consciousness, you'll find that dogs, to express happiness, wag their tails. And if you see a dog that's really into its delight, it'll wag its whole lower body violently. And you'll even see human beings, if their consciousness is down in the lower part of their bodies, they'll do the same thing. They don't have tails to wag, but whereas you'll notice this, that the more people are happy, the more they look up, the more their movements are upward. There is something, it's physical, and yet it's universal. And you can't say that, well, I'm a Christian and therefore my soul rises. Oh, if you were a Hindu, if you were a pagan, it wouldn't matter. It would be the same thing. Whenever you're inspired, your energy goes up. Whenever you feel down in consciousness, or whenever anything takes you downward in your body, that also tends to bring your consciousness to states of sadness, depression, unhappiness. These are simple facts, and you can't change them by saying, well, I'm a Buddhist. You can't change them by saying, well, I happen to believe differently. We belong to a church that really believes in stimulating these lower parts of the spine. It doesn't work. You can see even in people's faces, in the way they look, in the way they move. You can see something that indicates that they're somebody who, they have something to give. They have something you'd like. I've had that opportunity to meet a few people in my life who were very saintly people. And I remember talking to this innkeeper down in Big Sur area, and he was sort of a bear of a man like this. And I said to him, you know, I think I may have met as many as 6 people in my life who I felt knew God. He said, shake, you just met the 7th. Well, by his very gesture, you know, he didn't know God. If he'd known God, he wouldn't have done it in that way. There are just certain things that show who you are and what you are. Now, these are what we want to develop in understanding that God is for everyone. Because whereas not everybody is looking for the cosmic ground of being, I must admit I'm not one of them myself. I couldn't care less about the cosmic ground of being. I got my own problems. But when you speak of bliss, and when you say that what I really want is bliss, I'll have to say, yeah, I do. And when you say that this will give it to you and that won't, I'll listen. Now that's the beautiful thing about this book. It shows you how by putting your consciousness in the right way, that your whole life will change. I had this absolutely wonderful experience in my life. I was I must admit I was pretty desperate. I was wanting truth. I wanted something that would help all humanity to find more joy, more peace of mind, more happiness. And in fact, happiness was my real goal. To me, I wanted truth, but that was truth. And I just couldn't find it anywhere. And I tried it in science, and I tried it in politics and poetry, and I wanted to be a dramatist and a poet and all these things. And I looked around and I said, but people don't have it. And when I read Autobiography of a Yogi by Yogananda, I just knew that was for me. This was back in 1948. So that makes 55 years, right? Okay. And I just took really just about the next bus from New York to Los Angeles and met him. And he accepted me as a disciple. He was living in this country at the time. And mostly when people make lightning decisions, it's sort of lightning in and lightning out. It wasn't that way at all. I knew. And I've never for a second had a change of heart. I knew this was for me. I knew that what he represented was for me. But what was wonderful about it was that I didn't have to make myself dogmatic in order to believe. I didn't have to be a true believer. He didn't ask that of me. He said, try it, see if it works. And I found that it did work. It does work. The more I did of this, the more I felt joy. The more I meditated, the more I made God my friend, not somebody I put up there on Mount Golgotha or something. I mean, I was remembering a hymn that we used to sing in Ploiești. I grew up in Romania, but this was at the Church of England. There was a green hill far, far away, beyond the city walls. And finally it came to, He died to save us all. We may not know, we cannot tell the pains He had to bear. I respect that, okay. I can't love it, for God's sake. The thought that somebody had to go through all that misery to make me happy. Frankly, there's something that doesn't go right, doesn't sit right with me. And in fact, I don't believe it for a moment. If I think that Jesus Christ drew thousands of people, I honestly cannot believe that He drew them by sitting there and grieving for their sins. If I were to talk to you tonight saying, oh, I'm so sorry for you, I think you'd scatter like birds before the hunter. What He had was something they wanted. And what I found that Yogananda had was something I wanted. He was a man who lived what he taught. And there was I remember sitting in his presence when he was talking about some job that had to be done on the road. It had nothing to do with God, religion, yoga practice, nothing. But somehow he emanated this aura of happiness, of bliss, that I just felt so blissful. I had to close my eyes. It was so true. Everything he said, he made you experience. Another beautiful thing was that he didn't talk about himself. He didn't say, look at me. I looked at him because I could see that he was a good example, but he didn't talk like that. I remember one time I was sitting there and he was busy writing, and I was thinking how fortunate I am, what a joy to have met this man, to have known him. And when he finished his work, he asked me to help him get up. His legs weren't all that well at the time. And he looked in my eyes for a second. He said, just a bulge of the ocean. In other words, he was saying, I'm only a wave on the ocean, I'm nothing. Look at the ocean. That's what he always tried to help us to understand. Not him, the great leader, and so on, none of that. But always, he is the guru, he is the truth, he is the teacher. This is what Jesus did. This is what all great men and women of God have done. And this is the wonderful thing that they came to bring to us. Jesus did not come to show us how wonderful he was. He came to show us how wonderful we are. If we could just learn to turn our direction away from the things that make us unhappy. It's all about happiness. It's not God up there saying, you didn't do that, you didn't eat your porridge for breakfast. Hey, what does God care about that? Listen, He knows who we are. You know, one of the wonderful things about living with a real man of God was this, that I knew He knew every single thought I thought. There was one, He showed it. It wasn't just a beautiful imagination. If I did one thing that wasn't right, He'd call me on it. And I was grateful. I wasn't saying, oh God, He found me out. No, I was there to be taught. I remember one time I was talking in a group of people who were, there was this one man who was a very sort of atheistical psychiatrist. And I was trying to talk to him about some of the marvelous things I have seen. And I could see that in his mind he was thinking, now let's see, I probably have an opening Wednesday morning for this, this bird. When I met Yogananda a couple of days later, he said, you know, when you're talking to skeptics and materialists, don't talk about these things. Don't talk about miracles and so on, because they're not ready for it. I said, you knew? He said, I know every thought you think. Now you figure that one out. That's quite a statement. But Jesus showed that. Great masters in India have shown that. And the thing is that you have that capacity also in yourself. It's not that they are special creations of God. We are all special creations of God. The more you are in God, the more God shows you these things, the more you understand. But it was marvelous to live with somebody who knew me to my core. And he could call me on things that I didn't see. Well, I was grateful. Thank God I was grateful, because some people weren't. And they lost that chance. But don't forget, God does know your every thought. You can't hide from Him. You do something wrong and you think, oh, I hope He didn't see that one. He knows it. He saw it. He was it. He was in that act. He's in everything. But the thing is, He wants to help us. He wants us to have that which our true nature calls for. We want bliss because that's who we are. We want joy. Yes, we want love, but love of an impersonal kind. And that's why bliss is a better concept than love, which can become romantic, personal, attached, and so on. Whereas bliss is impersonal. We all want that. And the thing is that we don't know how to get it. Now, there are ways to find how to get it. First of all, we have to understand that bliss, or fulfillment of any kind at all, is not in things. You aren't going to find it if you get that new job. You aren't going to find it if you get that raise. You're not going to find it if you get $1 million that you win at Reno or something. You're not going to find it if you find the perfect mate. You're not going to find it in anything outside yourself. The secret is to find it inside you. You are that. When you can see that, when you can see that everything in the world is really a reflection of who you are. You know, there were people in concentration camps who were in probably the worst and most negative situation that one could imagine, and yet they were happy. Why? Because they thought of other people. They thought of how can I help people. There are two kinds of self-consciousness. One is taking, shrinking, egotism. The other is sharing with others. Jesus put it beautifully. He said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Why more blessed? Because it's more blissful. The more you take, the less happiness you have. And you'll notice that people who think in terms of what I'm getting and accumulating, their eyes are dull. All you have to do is look at people's eyes all over the world. You see, there are some people who have happy eyes. Some people, and mostly, very often it's the rich people, they have unhappy eyes. I don't say all rich people are unhappy. but it's a greater reason to be unhappy because they have put so much faith in something outside themselves. I've met some people who were rich who were blissful, but it was inside, it wasn't outside. When you've discovered that this world is not giving you what you want, when you've discovered that people aren't going to give you what you want, when you've decided, like this man who in Vermont, he lived in a village there, and people called him the town grouch, because he was always sour, and he'd snarl at the children, and they'd run over his flower beds, which of course they did even more, because they knew that it would rile the poor guy. And he just was all up, always angry about something. Finally, one day, this guy came smiling and singing out the door, and he blessed the children as they ran over his flower bed, and the town could stand this only so long. Finally, they got a committee, and this committee went to him, and they said, well, what gives? I mean, you were so unhappy, and now suddenly you're happy. What's the difference? What have you done? He said, it was perfectly simple. I kept waiting for life to make me happy, and I realized it just wasn't going to make me happy, so I decided I'm going to be happy anyway. You know, it's really absurd, but it's just that easy. It's amazing how much you can enjoy life if you make up your mind to be happy. I remember there was this one woman, and my mother commented on her. She said, you can see that it's her deliberate philosophy to be happy. Well, you've all met people like that. They don't have any special reason to be happy. I remember in Bucharest, when I was a child, there was a group of gypsies that we met as we were going to a skating rink. And they have a particular chant when they're begging from you. No, Mom, come on, cat pentru zile. I haven't eaten for 3 days, and some pathetic whine that they get in their voices. So we gave them something and went skating, and we were there for probably a couple of hours. We came out into the street, and we saw them laughing and playing, and as soon as they saw us, no am cap pentru treze. But I don't know if they were really happy, but I can say this, that I've seen an awful lot of poor people who are. And it's a wonderful thing to see, that no matter what they have or don't have, if they are happy inside, then they've got something that is really theirs. Now that you can have. You don't have to worry about the raise that you're looking for. You don't have to worry about getting the right job or the right person. Nothing's going to get it together for you. It's always like the waves on the sea. You've got this together, and suddenly here comes another one. It just is the law of life. Somebody asked me a question, do you think all your tests are over? Oh, no. I certainly don't think so. Life goes on that way. I don't know if you believe in astrology, but if you do, I have a very interesting horoscope too, with lots of negative conjunctions or oppositions or whatever you want to call it. I remember I was talking to somebody years ago about the hard lives people have. And I said, you know, it's strange, I don't seem to have any hardships. She said, no hardships, my God. She started listing all the things I'd gone through, and yeah. But it just didn't matter. Don't take things seriously. This life is a play. And you know, there's someday it's going to be all over. This is a mortuary, a good place. Good thing to think about. When I take a shower sometimes, I think, well, this arm that I'm washing is going to be dust someday. Why get morbid about it? You're not this blasted arm. I mean, if I were, I'd think, boy, it's getting less and less every year. I said to somebody once a few years ago about my large legs, she said, you don't have any large legs, they're thin. I looked at myself in a mirror, my God, they'd become thin. You aren't this body, you aren't what you think you are in the way of outward things. You've got something inside you that just never changes. It's eternal. And it'll come and go. Bodies don't matter. You'll die, it won't change you and who you are. So what you need to do is forgive me, is understand what you're really looking for in life. You're looking for bliss. And religion, to the extent that it can give you that, has something to give you that no other field in life can give you. Science can't give it to you. It'll give you a nice new insight into the universe. It'll give you nice things. You wouldn't be able to drive the freeways if it weren't for science. Yeah, art has something to give you, but boy, I don't know about this century in art. Or let's say the 20th century, since we're out of it by now. There was one painting that Picasso, he was a bit of a wag, and he presented this painting to the world as his new painting. Actually, it had been done by his pet monkey. And everybody was saying, oh, it's so wonderful. Oh, look at this masterpiece of this great master artist. Then when the furor was at its height, he said, well, it was done by my monkey. He had a sense of humor. But nonetheless, he did terrible things, in my opinion. I mean, when you get faces sort of distorted and divided and so on, that doesn't lead me toward bliss. I always look at a piece of art and I think, does it make me more blissful? I look at a person on a portrait, and I think, would I want that person in my living room? If I would, yes, but if I wouldn't, but it was because it was done by some great artist, therefore what a treasure, no, you can have it. So I can sell it for a few million, okay, but I don't want it. So the thing is then that we need in the arts, in science, in politics, in everything, to understand what is life really all about. A business deal shouldn't be only, and this is something that we do at Ananda, we're not only interested in, will it give us a profit? Will it make us happier? It will not make you happier if you haven't been honest. Therefore, why get into it? The bottom line isn't money. The bottom line is happiness. If, in concluding a deal, you feel you've done the right thing, not only for yourself but for other people, this is good. If, on the other hand, you think that what you're doing is, you know, we had a fire up at Ananda back in 1976. It destroyed 21 of our homes, 400 and something acres of our 600 or 700 acres. It was a major catastrophe. And it turned out that our neighbors found out that the cause of that fire was a faulty spark arrestor on a county vehicle. Well, of course, they were all excited that we can sue the county, we can get all this money back, and so on. Well, I thought, I don't like to take my bad luck out on other people. What would be the gain? I wrote to the county supervisors. I said, I know you're waiting for us to sue you because we were the biggest losers in this fire. I said, we're not going to sue you. We'll just take it on the chin. We had no insurance. We had no income. We had no real reason to think we wouldn't go bankrupt. But I thought, joy, bliss, integrity, these come first. And our neighbors, they didn't finally have to sue. They managed to settle. We didn't have anything to settle because we didn't make a complaint. But 10 years later, our neighbors were still grieving over what they'd lost. One day later, we were out there joyfully cleaning up the land, getting ready to do the next thing. You don't have to let conditions or outward circumstances condition your happiness. Happiness is something you can carry with you all the time. We went skiing a few years ago, and I didn't realize it, but my tires were bald. And when I reached the snow line, we had to stop to put on chains, but when I put the brake on, the car took off like a snow goose, and it hit the side of a Greyhound bus. Now, if you're ever worried about the safety of Greyhound buses, at least I can give you this as a testimonial. We didn't even scratch it. The bus was totaled. The car was totaled. So we had to leave it there, and we got up on the bus to go skiing. And this woman said to me, oh, what a pity you've lost your car. And I hadn't thought of it as a pity. It was a fact, but I hadn't analyzed it as being good or bad. But when she said that, I thought, well, in a week I'd feel fine. Why should I waste a whole week? I feel fine. Well, the next time you find something that isn't going the way you want to, think of that. You'll feel fine sooner or later. Why waste all that time? Just live in happiness now. Your happiness is not conditioned by anything or anyone. Be happy. I don't mean that when somebody comes to you with a great pain, you just sit there and giggle. This would be inappropriate. But you can say in your heart, well, okay, I'm sorry for him because he's feeling unhappy, but you don't have to get drawn down into that unhappiness. Whatever you are, you can keep with you under all circumstances. With that, then you begin to understand that there is a consciousness behind everything. And the more you can live in that, the more you begin to feel that higher consciousness. In other words, when you look for bliss, you begin to see that other people are looking for the same thing. You begin to feel a kinship with them. And you begin to sense that in life, I was out there exercising in my garden just recently, and I was looking at the pansies and the violets and the different flowers, and I was thinking, I simply can't buy the dogma of modern biology that says this is all mindless. I can't help thinking those pansies love being beautiful. I can't help thinking that nature loves producing beauty. Maybe that's a sentiment. But you know, the more you have that kind of sentiment, the more you begin to feel that there is a rapport. And you can actually make things happen. You know, the story of Luther Burbank is really fascinating. Because he could talk to the flowers, he could talk to the plants, and bring them to life. He could make them do what they wanted to. The big objection that fellow scientists had against him was that they couldn't replicate his experiments. He'd be able to go down the line of plants and say, well, save this one, destroy that one. Save this one, destroy that one. And out of a whole bunch, he would say, save a few. And a friend of his said, well, how can you tell? He said, well, why don't you try this? Just get some of these plants and plant them and see. Remember the ones I said wouldn't grow and the ones that will. And the man had to admit after trying it that all the ones that Burbank had said wouldn't thrive, didn't thrive. He had a certain rapport. Now you can't have a rapport with nature, with other people, with life, if you're just in yourself like this. You begin, when you're seeking bliss, to realize that's what everybody wants. And you begin to want to share that bliss with people. And it makes you feel a certain kinship of all life. So that when you see unhappy people, you don't think, oh, it's his problem. You think, well, I'd like to help that guy. And in that, your feelings also begin to expand. Without feeling, we're just automatons. Feeling is the source of consciousness. Now, that kind of approach to God introduces an element into it that doesn't make you have to excuse this cough. It doesn't make you have to think that God is something up there that you're supposed to love, damn it, and I don't understand how. You want that bliss. And when you understand that that's what he is, you want him. Bliss is the goal of life. It's the goal of religion. And the more we love God as bliss, the more we find that love ceases to be an abstraction. It becomes something very real. It becomes a central part of your life. So it's not a matter of fanaticism. It's a matter of suddenly coming to life. This was one of the amazing things that I found living with a great teacher, that he had that consciousness of bliss and that love for God that was a real love because it was a love for bliss. And I found that it made my life finally have some kind of meaning. Now, I've dedicated all my life to trying to share that sense of meaning. I'm not interested in converting you to my path. I'm trying to convert you to yourself. You're much more important than any path you can follow. But if you can, in your own heart, learn to know who you are, who you are in relation to a higher reality, if you can learn that your real nature is bliss, if I can see in the lives of the people that I talk to, and we find this up at Ananda, and here people come with sort of a hard shell around them, and even in a few days you see that shell breaking down and you see a sweetness coming out. Isn't that what we all want? You're not giving people anything that you want of them, but yes, you're giving them what they really want. There's a beautiful story from the life of St. Francis. This one of the songs that were sung here tonight was inspired by his life. Lord Most High, our Heavenly Father. And there was one time when there were, I think it was 3 criminals in their area who were busy committing all sorts of crimes, outraging the public, finally making people so furious with them that they got their pitchforks and whatever they could get together, and they were really going to string these people up. And they came running for help to one of the monasteries that St. Francis had founded. Now, St. Francis was away at the time, and the man he'd left in charge, when he saw who these men were and knew who they were, he just told them to get out. We don't want evil people around here. And they left cursing him too. Well, St. Francis came, and this monk was outraged at the way these men had dared to come to this house of God. And St. Francis was outraged, but he was outraged with the monk. He said, you didn't behave like a child of God. These are children of God. I ask you to go and find those men and bring them here. And they did. And St. Francis, when they came, he said, my brothers. Well, boy, those men hadn't been called brothers for a while. He said, why do you live the way you do? You're not happy living that way. Well, they'd never heard of it that way. Everybody else had said, we're not happy having you around. He said, you're not happy living like that. And he went on in this way, trying to help them to see that what they really wanted, they weren't getting the way they were living. Whereas if they lived in a way that was more harmonious, they would find it. Well, he converted them, and they became monks. And it is said in history and legend, whatever, that they died holy lives. Well, that's what the world needs. Not punishment, not anger, not warfare, not destruction. We need, yes, love. But I mean, it's hard to love people if they're going to be so unlovable as some people manage to be. But you can love their potential for bliss, because everybody in the world is looking for bliss. And the only thing wrong with them is that they don't know where to find it. They think they're going to find it by robbing, by killing, by doing this thing and that thing. They won't. When they really can understand that, oh, I just made a mistake, that's all. Sin is a mistake, that's all it is. You got it wrong. God's willing to give you time to get it right. God's not going to throw you into hell for all eternity for the mistakes of a few years here. I mean, I can just imagine a teenager brought up in the jungle of a big city and perhaps joins a gang and maybe gets killed in a gang war. And so he goes to where you expect such people to go, down below. Now, this thing is supposed to last eternity, right? Well, 100 years, that's already pretty long. But 1,000 years? It's not eternity, I'm sorry, but it's not. It goes on beyond 1,000 years. It goes on to beyond 1 billion years. I can imagine this guy after 2 billion years or so with a friend of his in this place of incarceration saying, well, what are you here for? I can imagine this guy saying, well, I don't really quite remember. How can a finite cause have an infinite effect? It doesn't make sense. Whatever you are, you're a child of God. God's not going to punish you forever. That great painting of Michelangelo's in the Sistine Chapel, it's great, but it's pretty awful, my God. There's God putting all his energy into damning these poor souls who have somehow not got it right yet. And these blessed ones, he doesn't even talk about bliss. He's too much in his anger. Well, I don't think I could love a God who's just always getting angry. The real source of all existence is bliss. All life looks for it. All life gets it wrong, yes, but bit by bit you learn your lessons. Bit by bit you find, well, that didn't work and this does. When I took from somebody, I wasn't really happy. When I shared with somebody, I didn't have it anymore, and yet I was happy. How come? What is this? Bit by bit you learn that the more you can expand your sympathies, the more you can include other people in your happiness, the more you begin to find what you want for yourself too. Bliss isn't a thing. It's a state of consciousness. And that state of consciousness comes the more you can get away from your sense of ego. But you know, this is another problem that people have. When they talk about the spiritual teachings and they hear that you've got to get rid of the ego, well, for God's sakes, that's all you've got is your ego. Why should you get rid of it? The answer is you don't have to get rid of it because you couldn't possibly get rid of it. What you can and must do, though, is understand that your ego is not just this little body. It's a sense of self that pervades the whole universe. Everything is that self. You are a part of that self. That's how Yogananda could tell me what I was thinking when he wasn't anywhere near where I was. He said to some woman once, "You have a sour taste in your mouth, don't you?" She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I'm as much in your body as I am in this body." He'd broken down the barriers of his ego that made him think, or that make people think, I'm this body. And you've done it, all of you, to some extent. Your child suffers, you suffer with that child. I remember I was very seriously ill as a child in Bucharest. And I remember my mother weeping. And I remember it was so obvious that her pain was not for herself. It was for me. We've all felt sorrow for other people, sympathy for other people. We feel their gladness. You aren't separate from other people. You're a part of them. As John Donne said, no man is an island. If you can break that sense of I, and expand it, that's the whole trick. You don't get rid of ego. You expand the sense of self so that it's no longer a separative thing, but a unitive thing. When you can do that, when people see or think about Jesus on the cross, no man could see, no man could tell the pains he had to bear. They don't know what they're talking about, for God's sake. The pain he had to bear was the misunderstanding of people who didn't understand how much he loved them, how willing he was to go through everything to help them. His mind was on them. What hurt him more than anything else was that they didn't understand. What hurt him was people's constant rejection of the one thing they really want. I mean, I can see these great souls wanting to just shake people. Can't you understand? But no, they won't. I believe in reincarnation because I think it's an absolute essential. But sooner or later, at any rate, I certainly believe that all of us have to come to that point where we see we've tried this, we've tried that, we've tried the other thing. It didn't work. And suddenly we found a few little glimmers. Oh, well, here's something that did work. And so the more we go in that direction, the more we find that we become really happy, and that happiness becomes something deeper than anything emotional. It isn't because we've got that cottage by the sea. It's that wherever we are, we feel this bliss. You know Paul Brunton in his book, The Seven-Story Mountain? Not Paul Brunton, Thomas Merton, Seven-Story Mountain. He said a couple of women in Harlem living in all that squalor, he said they were so happy because they thought of other people, shared with other people. He said, I would call them saints. It doesn't matter where your body is. It's where your consciousness is. But the more you live this principle, the more you will see that God is for everyone. Because everyone is a part of God. No wave can get away from the ocean. The wave just has to understand that its fulfillment will lie in reclaiming that it is a part of that ocean and not in always trying to get away from that ocean. Once you understand that, it's so simple. Do get to know yourself. You're a fine person. And if you don't know it, it's because you haven't yet faced that reality. Thank you all.